Chapter 1. The number. Jason Evans wasn't looking at Susan. That was the annoying part. If he'd been staring at her all night like some suspicious boyfriend conducting surveillance, at least he'd have an excuse for what happened next. Instead, he was talking with Mark and Emily at their usual table near the back of the club. "I'm telling you," Mark said, pointing with the neck of his beer bottle. "If you buy a smart refrigerator, you're admitting defeat as an adult." Jason laughed. "How?" "Because the fridge shouldn't be smarter than the person buying groceries." Emily rolled her eyes. "My refrigerator sends shopping reminders." Mark looked horrified. "What happens if it becomes self-aware?" "It reminds me to buy eggs." "That's exactly how it starts." Jason shook his head. Their friend group always managed to have ridiculous conversations in public. Across the room, Susan was dancing with a few of her friends. Nothing unusual. Nothing concerning. Exactly the kind of thing she'd always done. The dance floor was crowded. Music pounded through the speakers. Colored lights flashed across faces and tables. Jason took a drink and glanced toward her. Not because he was checking on her. Just because she was there. She was laughing. Of course she was. Susan laughed more easily than anyone he'd ever met. It was one of the reasons he'd fallen in love with her. 3 years together, and seeing her smile still made something loosen pleasantly in his chest. She caught his eye from across the room. Waved. He waved back. Then she disappeared into the crowd again. "You're doing it." Jason looked at Emily. "Doing what?" "The face." "What face?" "The future husband face." Mark nodded immediately. "Oh, that's definitely the face." Jason frowned. Neither explanation helped. Emily smirked. "The one where you look at Susan and completely forget everyone else exists." He groaned. "I do not do that." "You absolutely do that," Mark said. "You've done it for years." Jason opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because arguing would be pointless. His friends had apparently decided this was true. The conversation drifted elsewhere. Vacations, sports, terrible movies, normal Friday night topics. The kind of evening Jason genuinely enjoyed. Good friends, good relationship, good life. He'd spent years building toward exactly this. A stable career, comfortable apartment, enough savings to think seriously about the future. Most people would probably assume an engagement was coming soon. Susan certainly did. Their families did. Half their friends practically treated it as a foregone conclusion. Jason wasn't there yet. Not because he didn't love her. He did. Completely. That was the problem. His eyes drifted toward the bar area. Susan wasn't dancing anymore. She was talking to someone. A man. Jason barely registered it. Because that happened constantly. Susan was friendly. People responded to friendly. The world wasn't complicated. Attractive woman plus outgoing personality equaled conversations everywhere. She spoke to old women, children, store clerks, taxi drivers, random people in elevators, men, lots of men. Most of the time it never bothered Jason. What bothered him was what occasionally followed. The flirting. Not serious flirting. Not cheating. Never anything close. Just enough encouragement to keep conversations alive longer than they should have. Something she'd always brushed off as harmless. He watched the interaction casually. The guy was clearly interested. That much was obvious. Susan laughed at something he said. Jason felt the familiar flicker of irritation. Not anger. Just that old recurring thought. What happens in another 10 years? 20? 30? He trusted Susan. But trust didn't eliminate common sense. A man could trust a bridge while still inspecting the supports occasionally. The thought immediately annoyed him, because people weren't bridges. Relationships weren't engineering projects. Still, the concern lingered. The stranger said something else. Susan laughed again. Then she reached into her purse. Jason frowned. The man held up his phone. Jason's eyes narrowed slightly. No. Susan pulled out her own phone. No. For a moment he honestly thought he'd misunderstood what he was seeing. Then both looked down at their screens. Tapped. Smiled. Finished. The stranger slipped his phone away. Susan did the same. Jason stared. The room suddenly felt very quiet despite the music. Chapter 2. What it looks like. Jason stared for perhaps 3 seconds. Felt much longer. The stranger said something. Susan smiled. Then she turned away and started walking back toward the dance floor as if nothing unusual had happened. As if she hadn't just exchanged numbers with a man who'd spent the last 10 minutes hitting on her. As if Jason hadn't watched the entire thing. His stomach sank. Not because he thought she'd cheated. Oddly enough, that wasn't what bothered him. If anything, cheating would have been easier to process. Cheating was obvious. Cheating was a clear line. This felt worse because it lived in that gray area Susan was always wandering into. The area where she insisted everything was innocent while everyone around her could plainly see how it looked. "You okay?" Mark's voice pulled him back. Jason blinked. "What?" "You look like somebody just told you your taxes got audited." Jason glanced toward the dance floor again. Susan had rejoined her friends. Laughing. Smiling. Completely normal. Completely unaware. And for the first time in 3 years, Jason didn't know what to do with that. He set his drink down. I think I'm gonna head out. Emily frowned. Everything all right? Yeah. The answer came automatically. A lie delivered so smoothly he almost believed it himself. Mark looked unconvinced. You sure? Jason forced a smile. Just tired. Nobody argued. There wasn't much to argue about. People left clubs early all the time. Jason grabbed his jacket and walked toward the exit. Halfway there he expected someone to stop him. Susan. One of her friends. Anybody. Nobody did. The cool night air hit him like a splash of water. For several seconds he simply stood outside, staring across the parking lot. His heartbeat had settled. The anger hadn't. What made him angry wasn't the stranger. Men flirting with Susan wasn't exactly breaking news. The guy didn't owe him anything. He wasn't the problem. Susan was. Or rather, whatever thought process had convinced her that exchanging numbers with him was acceptable. Jason walked toward his car. A memory surfaced uninvited. 3 months earlier. A restaurant. Another man lingering too long at the bar chatting with her. 6 months before that. A brewery. A different guy buying her a drink she politely declined after 10 minutes of conversation. A year before that. A friend's wedding. A groomsman who spent half the reception orbiting Susan like a confused moon. At the time, each individual instance had felt small. Harmless. Forgettable. Now they stacked together in his mind. Not because he'd been secretly keeping score. Because suddenly he couldn't stop wondering how often these situations extended beyond what he witnessed. He leaned against his car. No, stop. That road wasn't useful. If he started inventing possibilities, he'd drive himself insane. The issue wasn't what might have happened. The issue was what he had literally watched happen. A man flirted with his girlfriend. His girlfriend exchanged numbers with him. End of story. No assumptions required. Jason climbed into the car. The steering wheel felt cool beneath his hands. He sat there for several minutes before starting the engine. By the time he pulled away, he'd already made one decision. No more pretending this didn't bother him. No more waiting for it to magically stop bothering him. The conversation needed to happen. Whether either of them enjoyed it was irrelevant. Susan didn't notice Jason was gone for almost 20 minutes. Not because she'd forgotten about him. Because she'd assumed he was somewhere nearby. Talking. Socializing. Being Jason. She returned to the table carrying drinks. Only to find Emily looking around. Where's Jason? Susan set the glass down. What do you mean? I thought he was with you. Susan laughed. No. Mark looked up. He left. Her smile faded. What? Said he was tired. Tired? The confusion in her voice made both friends exchange a glance. Yeah, Mark said slowly. About 20 minutes ago. Susan pulled out her phone immediately. A text message waited for her. Went home. We'll talk later. Her stomach dropped. The wording wasn't angry. That made it worse. Jason wasn't dramatic. He wasn't passive-aggressive. He wasn't the type to send cryptic messages. Which meant every word had probably been chosen carefully. We'll talk later. Not see you later. Not good night. Not love you. We'll talk later. Emily's eyes narrowed. What happened? I don't know. But even as Susan said it, a memory surfaced. The guy at the bar. The phone numbers. For a moment she wondered if Jason had somehow seen that. Then immediately dismissed the idea. If he had, she'd explain. The guy wanted her number. She gave him a fake one. End of issue. Except the anxiety remained. By midnight she was heading home. Their apartment was quiet. The television wasn't on. The kitchen lights were off. Jason sat on the couch. Waiting. Susan hated that immediately. Waiting implied preparation. Preparation meant he'd been thinking. And when Jason spent time thinking, he usually arrived somewhere difficult to argue with. She closed the door. Hey! Hey! No smile. No anger either. Just calm. Dangerously calm. Susan walked over carefully. Are you okay? Jason looked at her for several seconds. Then he asked a question so directly it caught her off guard. How many men have you given your number to while we've been together? Her eyebrows shot upward. What? How many? Why are you asking that? His expression didn't change. Susan. A knot formed in her stomach. You saw that guy at the bar. I did. Relief immediately replaced some of her fear. Oh. She sat down. Jason, it wasn't what you think. What do I think? She opened her mouth, then stopped, because for once she wasn't entirely sure. I gave him a fake number. Jason stared at her. That's supposed to help? Well, yes. She genuinely meant that. To her, it explained everything. The stranger got rejected without realizing it. No confrontation. No drama. No hurt feelings. Problem solved. Instead, Jason looked even more troubled. You've done that before. It wasn't a question. Susan hesitated. That was all the answer he needed. Jason leaned back against the couch. How often? It's not a big thing. Susan. She sighed. Sometimes. Guys approach me. I know. They ask for my number. I know. I don't want to create a scene. So you give them fake contact information. Yes. Jason laughed once. There wasn't any humor in it. and hearing it made her chest tighten. Do you hear yourself? I wasn't cheating. I didn't say you were. Then what's the problem? The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Jason stared. For the first time since she'd met him, she watched disappointment settle across his face. Not anger, not outrage. Disappointment that hurt far more than shouting ever could. You honestly don't see it? Susan crossed her arms. No. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something. The problem isn't whether the number was real. Then what is it? The problem is you were comfortable accepting attention from a guy who was obviously interested in you. I was being polite. He wasn't trying to be your friend. That doesn't mean you exchanged numbers. They weren't real numbers. You exchanged them. The conversation seemed to be moving in circles. Susan felt frustration building. So you'd rather I start arguments with strangers? I'd rather you establish a boundary. Silence filled the apartment. Jason rubbed a hand across his face. Suddenly he looked exhausted. Do you know what bothered me most? Susan didn't answer. You did it right in front of me. His voice remained calm. That somehow made every word heavier. You weren't sneaking around. You weren't hiding. You didn't think twice. His eyes met hers. And that's what scared me. For the first time that night, Susan couldn't think of a response. Because she had not thought twice. Not even once. The possibility that it would hurt him had never crossed her mind. And judging by the look on Jason's face, that realization had crossed his. Chapter 3, Voices of Reason. Susan barely slept. She spent most of the night replaying the conversation in her head, searching for the moment where things had gone wrong. The problem was she couldn't find it. Not because Jason hadn't explained himself. He had, very clearly. She simply didn't agree with him. At least not completely. By morning, the apartment felt strange. Jason had left early for the gym. Normally she'd wake up wrapped around him, stealing half his pillow and most of the blankets. Instead she woke up alone. The empty space beside her bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Around noon she texted her friends. Brunch? 3 of them agreed immediately. By 1 o'clock she was sitting at their usual table, determined to get validation from people who actually understood her. 10 minutes later, she began regretting that decision. I think he's right. Susan stared at Emily. What? Emily didn't back down. I think Jason's right. Susan looked to the others for support. Instead she found uncomfortable expressions, which wasn't encouraging. Seriously? Susan asked. Rachel winced. A little, yeah. Susan blinked. You guys saw what happened. We did. I gave the guy a fake number. We know. So what's the issue? The 3 women exchanged looks. The kind of looks people shared when deciding who had to deliver bad news. Susan hated those looks. Finally Megan volunteered. The fake number was never the point. It absolutely is the point. No, Megan said. It's the outcome. Jason's upset about the process. Susan folded her arms. I don't understand the difference. Emily sighed. Okay, let's use a different example. Susan already hated where this was going. If a woman approached Jason every weekend and flirted with him, what would you expect him to do? Tell her he's taken. Good. And if instead he stood there laughing, talking, accepting the attention, and then exchanged phone numbers? Susan immediately frowned. That's different. Emily raised an eyebrow. Why? Because it just was. Except the answer sounded much less convincing inside her own head. He wouldn't actually talk to her. That's not an answer. Susan looked away. Megan jumped in. What if he told you afterward that he always gave fake numbers? Then nothing happened. Rachel nearly choked on her coffee. Nothing happened? He didn't cheat. The table went quiet. Susan suddenly realized she was losing. Badly. And she had no idea how that had happened. Rachel set her cup down. Susan, can I be brutally honest? That sentence never led anywhere pleasant. Sure. You attract attention. Susan groaned. Not this again. No, listen. Rachel pointed a finger at her. You've spent your entire adult life getting approached by men. That's not my fault. Nobody said it was. Then what's your point? My point is that you're so used to it that you've started treating it as normal background noise. Susan opened her mouth, paused, closed it. That wasn't entirely unfair. Most women don't have guys asking for their number every time they go out. Megan nodded. To you, it's Tuesday. To Jason, he's watching random men hit on his girlfriend almost every weekend. Susan shifted uncomfortably. The image didn't sound nearly as harmless when someone else said it out loud. Still, she wasn't ready to surrender. I wasn't encouraging anyone. 3 skeptical faces stared back. Susan immediately became defensive. What? Emily leaned forward. Susan. What? You smile. Susan blinked. Okay. You laugh. I laugh at everybody. You touch people's arms when you're talking. That's just being friendly. Rachel smiled sympathetically. You make a lot of eye contact. Susan groaned. Oh my God. What? That sounds ridiculous. It does to you. Emily picked up her drink. Because you're not trying to flirt. Exactly. That doesn't mean they know that. The words landed harder than Susan expected. Because that was the first thing she'd heard all afternoon that genuinely connected. The men weren't experiencing her intentions. They were experiencing her behavior. And maybe those weren't always communicating the same message. Still, she stared down at the table. I love Jason. The statement came out quietly. Nobody argued. Nobody questioned it. That almost made it worse. Rachel smiled. We know. I would never cheat on him. We know. I want to marry him. We know. Susan sighed. Then why does it feel like everyone's acting like I'm some terrible girlfriend? The three women exchanged another look. This one was softer, less judgmental, more concerned. Emily reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Nobody thinks you're terrible. Then what? We think you've been careless. Susan looked away. The word stung because it sounded true. Careless. Not malicious. Not disloyal. Just careless. Megan took a sip of her coffee. Can I ask you something? Sure. When was the last time you actually shut one of those guys down immediately? Susan frowned. What do you mean? I mean immediately. Like, before the conversation even starts. Susan thought about it, then thought some more, and kept thinking. That couldn't be good. Eventually she realized she didn't have an answer. Not one she liked anyway, because her default response had always been to be nice, to avoid awkwardness, to avoid confrontation, to avoid making anyone feel bad. Rachel noticed the realization crossing her face. There it is. What? That's the problem. Susan sighed. I hate confrontation. We know. So what am I supposed to do? Emily laughed. Tell them you have a boyfriend. I do tell them. Eventually. The single word hit like a slap. Eventually. Not immediately. Eventually. After the conversation. After the laughing. After the attention. After the possibility had already been entertained. For the first time, Susan imagined what Jason had been seeing for the last 3 years. Not her intentions. Not her explanations. Just the behavior. The raw, visible behavior. And suddenly it looked different. Much different. Her stomach dropped. Oh. Nobody spoke. Because they could tell she'd finally arrived at the conclusion herself. Oh. Susan repeated. Rachel nodded slowly. Yeah. The weight of it settled heavily in her chest. Not because she thought Jason believed she'd cheated. He clearly didn't. The painful part was realizing she'd accidentally been creating the same concern over and over and over. Not once. Not twice. For years. She buried her face in her hands. Oh, this is bad. Emily laughed despite herself. That's actually the healthiest thing you've said all day. Susan groaned louder. What if he's done? I don't think he's done. What if he is? Then panicking won't help. Susan looked up. Fear was beginning to replace defensiveness. A much less comfortable emotion. I thought we were moving toward marriage. Emily's expression softened. I think you still can. Then why does it feel like everything changed overnight? Rachel answered that one. Because for him, it didn't happen overnight. The words settled heavily over the table. And Susan immediately knew she was right. For Jason, this wasn't one incident. It was simply the incident. The one that finally made him stop ignoring a concern he'd been carrying for years. A concern she'd never even noticed. For the first time since leaving the club, Susan wasn't wondering whether Jason had overreacted. She was wondering how long he'd been quietly hurting before finally reaching his limit. And that question scared her far more than the argument itself. Chapter 4. The repair plan. Jason enjoyed routines. That fact surprised most people because routines sounded boring when you described them out loud. Wake up. Gym. Work. Meal prep on Sunday. Pay bills early. Keep an emergency fund. Replace things before they broke. Nothing exciting. Nothing dramatic. Exactly how he liked it. Drama was expensive. Not financially. Emotionally. For the last week, his life had contained more emotional drama than the previous 6 months combined. He hated it. Which was why he was sitting alone at a coffee shop on a Wednesday evening wondering whether he'd made a mistake agreeing to meet Susan. His cup sat untouched. The chair across from him remained empty. For now. Part of him wished she'd cancel. Another part wanted her to hurry up and arrive. Neither feeling was particularly helpful. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. Hi. Jason looked up. Susan stood beside the table. She looked nervous. That was unusual. Normally she could walk into a room full of strangers and have 3 new friends before she'd finished introducing herself. Tonight her smile seemed uncertain. Hey. She sat down. For several seconds neither spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. Just awkward. An entirely different kind of unpleasant. Finally Susan took a breath. I owe you an apology. Jason remained quiet. Not because he was trying to be difficult. Because he wanted to hear the rest. I spent a few days being angry. She looked down. Then I talked to Emily and everyone else. That immediately caught his attention. Jason had a sudden suspicion he knew exactly how that conversation had gone. The corner of his mouth twitched. That bad? Susan groaned. You have no idea. Actually, I probably do. A tiny smile appeared. then faded. She folded her hands together. I didn't understand what you were saying. Jason nodded. I know. No, I mean really understand. He studied her expression. For the first time since the argument started, she didn't seem defensive, just thoughtful. I kept focusing on the fake number. Because that's what mattered to you, right? She sighed. And I completely missed why it mattered to you. Jason leaned back. That was fair. Painfully fair. They'd spent the entire night talking around each other because they'd been arguing different points. Susan had been defending herself against accusations Jason wasn't making. Jason had been addressing concerns Susan couldn't even see. What changed? He asked. Susan laughed softly. My friends stopped being cowards. That surprised an actual laugh out of him. She pointed at him. There it is. What? I haven't heard you laugh in a week. That's because this week hasn't been very funny. Fair. The brief warmth faded again. Their conversation settled back into serious territory. Susan stared at her coffee. I never thought about what it looked like. Jason didn't interrupt. If I'm being honest, I mostly thought about how uncomfortable those conversations make me. What conversations? The guys who approach me. He frowned slightly. You never told me that. I know. Susan shook her head. I hate rejecting people. Most people do. So I figured if I could get out of the interaction without hurting anybody's feelings, that was the best solution. Jason considered that. It sounded exactly like Susan. Kind-hearted. Conflict avoidant. Capable of creating bigger problems while trying to avoid smaller ones. You realize giving them a fake number isn't avoiding rejection. I do now. A smile tugged at her lips. It's just postponing it. Exactly. She groaned. Apparently everybody understands this except me. Jason remained silent. Because the truth was, she wasn't wrong. Susan had a genuinely unique ability to miss social implications that seemed obvious to everyone else. Not because she lacked intelligence. Quite the opposite. Her brain simply defaulted toward assuming the best in people. Something Jason had always admired. Something that occasionally drove him insane. She looked up. I'm sorry. The words were simple. No qualifications. No excuses. Just an apology. Jason believed she meant it. That wasn't the problem. The problem was trust rarely broke in one dramatic moment. It eroded slowly, like water against stone. And while apologies could stop the damage, they couldn't magically rebuild what had already worn away. Susan seemed to recognize that from his expression. Her shoulders sagged slightly. You don't believe me. I do. That surprised her. You do. Yes. Jason met her eyes. I believe you're sorry. The hopeful look on her face lasted less than a second before understanding replaced it. Oh, yeah. The silence returned. Not uncomfortable this time. Just honest. You want proof. Jason nodded. I want consistency. The word hung between them. Susan looked away. Probably because consistency wasn't something you could produce on demand. Consistency required time. Days, weeks, months, repeated behavior, repeated choices, repeated opportunities to fail and choosing differently instead. I can do that. I'm not saying you can't. Then what's the problem? Jason stared out the window. People moved along the sidewalk outside. Cars passed. Life continued as normal. Meanwhile, his relationship felt like it was balanced on a tightrope. The problem, he said carefully, is that I don't want a temporary adjustment. Susan flinched. The reaction told him she'd already considered that possibility herself. I understand. Do you? She nodded. I think so. Jason folded his arms. For years he'd ignored the concern, convincing himself it wasn't important enough to discuss. Until it finally became important enough. Now he wasn't interested in revisiting the same situation 6 months from now, or a year from now, or after a marriage. Definitely not after children. I need to know this isn't something you're doing just because you're afraid I'll leave. Susan was quiet for a long moment. Then she surprised him. I am afraid you'll leave. Jason blinked. The honesty caught him off guard. She laughed weakly. I figured maybe we should stop pretending. He couldn't argue with that. The last week had involved more honesty than the previous 6 months combined. I am afraid, she continued. But that's not why I want to change. Jason waited. That's not even really the right word. What isn't? Change. She sat back, thinking, searching for the right explanation. Finally she found it. I don't think I understood the effect my behavior was having. Jason listened carefully. Now I do. She swallowed. And if something I'm doing is hurting the person I want to spend the rest of my life with, why would I keep doing it? The answer came without hesitation. Because for the first time since the argument began, she wasn't defending herself. She was evaluating herself. That mattered. A lot. More than she'd probably realized. Still, it wasn't enough. Not yet. Because feelings weren't the issue. Behavior was. Jason took a slow breath. I don't want to break up. Susan visibly relaxed. Only a little. But enough for him to notice. Okay. But I'm also not moving forward. The tension returned immediately. What does that mean? It means exactly what it sounds like. Jason held her gaze. No engagement. No matter how gently he said it, the words hurt. He saw it happen. Saw the disappointment cross her face. Saw her fight to hide it. And if things improve? When they improve, Jason corrected. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. The correction hadn't been accidental. Jason noticed. So did she. A tiny smile appeared. Gone almost immediately. When they improve? She asked. We'll see where we are. Susan studied him carefully. Almost as carefully as he was studying her. Trying to determine whether there was still a future here. Whether the door remained open. Finally she nodded. I can live with that. Jason felt some of the weight in his chest ease. Not disappear. Just ease. For now that was enough. Neither of them got everything they wanted. But maybe that was what progress looked like. Not winning. Not losing. Just taking the next step forward without pretending the road behind them never happened. And for the first time since he'd walked out of the club, Jason felt like they were finally moving in the same direction again. Chapter 5. The test nobody planned. The first Real test arrived 6 weeks later. Neither of them planned it. Neither of them wanted it. Which was exactly what made it a test. Jason was standing in Marcus's backyard holding a paper plate and wondering why every birthday party eventually turned into the same event. The decorations changed. The age changed. The music changed. Yet somehow every gathering eventually became 30-somethings standing around discussing homeownership and lower back pain. It's because we're old now. Jason looked over. Mark was reaching for another hamburger. I didn't say that out loud. You didn't have to. I am not old. Mark pointed at him. You stretched before getting out of bed this morning. Jason hated that he couldn't deny it. Across the yard, laughter erupted from a group gathered near the patio. His eyes automatically found Susan. That still happened. Probably always would. She was talking with several women from their friend group. Smiling, laughing, looking relaxed. Things between them had improved over the previous month. Not magically, not instantly, just steadily. The way most healthy things improved. One decision at a time. One day at a time. Jason wasn't avoiding her. Susan wasn't walking on eggshells. The tension had eased. The conversation from the coffee shop had helped more than either of them expected. But the issue itself wasn't resolved. Not completely. Trust wasn't a light switch. You couldn't flip it back on just because you wanted to. You had to earn it. And earning required time. So far, Susan had been doing exactly that. Jason respected the effort. He noticed it too. The difference was he wasn't ready to celebrate after 6 weeks. A month and a half couldn't outweigh 3 years of concern. At least not in his mind. Mark followed his gaze. You two doing okay? Jason considered the question. Better. That's good. It is. Mark nodded. Then grinned. She's giving me the look. What look? The don't screw this up look. Jason glanced toward Susan. She immediately looked away. A little too quickly. He laughed despite himself. That look. That look. For the first time in a while, the situation felt almost normal. Then Marcus's cousin arrived. Jason only noticed him because several women near the patio suddenly became more interested in conversation. The guy looked like he'd been assembled in a laboratory dedicated to outdoor magazine covers. Tall, athletic, confident. The kind of man who probably had an easier life than the rest of humanity. Mark watched him walk by. I hate him already. You don't even know him. I don't need to. Jason chuckled. The afternoon continued. People mingled. Food disappeared. Music played. And eventually the inevitable happened. The cousin wandered over to Susan's group. Jason saw it happen from across the yard. The approach. The introduction. The smiles. The start of a conversation. Immediately, he felt the old feeling return. Not jealousy. Awareness. The same awareness that used to settle in his chest whenever situations like this developed. His attention drifted toward them without permission. The cousin was interested. That much was obvious. Jason could spot it within seconds now. The body language. The focus. The enthusiasm. Nothing subtle about it. The old version of Susan probably wouldn't have noticed. Or rather, she would have noticed eventually. After 10 minutes. After 20. After enough conversation to make everyone uncomfortable except her. Instead, something surprising happened. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Susan smiled politely, said something, then pointed toward Jason. The man followed her gesture. Their eyes met briefly. The cousin nodded, said something else. Susan laughed once, then walked away, straight toward Jason. The whole interaction took less than a minute. Mark nearly dropped his drink. Did that just happen? Jason frowned. What? She shut him down. Jason blinked. Mark looked genuinely impressed. That was textbook. A few moments later Susan reached them. She looked completely normal. Not proud. Not self-congratulatory. Just normal. Which somehow made the moment more significant. Mark pointed after the departing cousin. Rejected. Susan rolled her eyes. Don't be dramatic. That man got rejected so efficiently, he may never emotionally recover. He's fine. Jason watched her carefully. You okay? She looked confused. Why wouldn't I be okay? The answer came so naturally that he believed her. No resentment, no frustration, no sense of sacrifice, just a simple boundary. The realization caught him off guard. Susan noticed the look. What? Nothing. Her eyes narrowed. It's definitely not nothing. Jason hesitated, then shrugged. Just noticed something. And I'm noticing. A small smile appeared, not because he'd complimented her, because she'd understood exactly what he meant. The smile lingered for a second. Then she changed the subject, which strangely enough impressed him even more. She wasn't looking for points. She wasn't looking for recognition. She was simply behaving differently. That mattered. A lot. Later that evening they left together. The drive home was comfortable. Windows down. Music low. The kind of silence that only existed between people who knew each other well. Susan eventually broke it. You noticed. Jason sighed. There it is. There what is? The thing you've been trying not to ask all day. She laughed. Was it that obvious? Painfully. Susan stared out the window. Streetlights passed across her face. I wasn't looking for credit. I know. But, Jason thought carefully before answering. But 6 weeks isn't very long. The words landed exactly as he'd expected. Not badly. Just honestly. Susan nodded slowly. Fair. I mean that. I know. Jason glanced at her. I did notice. She smiled. I know. Most people don't change habits overnight. I know. You have. Trying to. No. Jason shook his head. You are. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Susan surprised him. I'm frustrated. Jason laughed. There it is. She pointed at him. Don't get excited. Too late. I'm frustrated because I want everything fixed already. That's normal. I know. Susan leaned her head against the seat. And I'm frustrated because you're right. Jason almost missed the last part. What? I said you're right. I don't hear that often. Enjoy it while it lasts. He grinned. She groaned dramatically. I'm serious. So am I. Susan folded her arms. I spent years building a certain reputation with you. Jason nodded. Yep. And now I have to rebuild it. Also yep. That's annoying. Jason laughed. This time she joined him. The tension disappeared. Not completely, but enough. Eventually Susan pointed out the windshield. You know what this reminds me of? What? A mortgage. Jason stared. A what? A mortgage. How? She smiled. You don't buy a house with one payment. The analogy immediately sounded familiar. A little too familiar. Jason slowly narrowed his eyes. Did you just steal my analogy from the coffee shop? Absolutely. I invented that. I improved it. You plagiarized it. Susan looked delighted with herself. Jason shook his head. For the first time in months, the future felt a little less uncertain. Not because the problem had vanished. Not because everything was solved. But because, for the first time, both of them were working toward the same solution. And that made all the difference. Chapter 6. Two Stubborn People. 3 months later, Jason realized something strange. He hadn't been paying attention. The realization came while he was sitting across from Susan at a restaurant on a Friday night. Not paying attention to her. Not paying attention to the room. Not paying attention to the possibility of a problem. The thought arrived so suddenly that he nearly laughed. For years, every time they'd gone out, a small part of his brain stayed alert. Not suspicious, just aware. Watching, waiting, evaluating. Now, he was halfway through a burger before noticing a man 2 tables away had been trying to get Susan's attention. The guy smiled. Susan smiled politely back, then returned to her conversation with Jason. The interaction lasted approximately 2 seconds, and Jason didn't care. The discovery was significant enough that he set his sandwich down. Susan immediately noticed. What? What? That face. He groaned. Apparently his friends weren't the only people capable of identifying his expressions. What face? The thinking face. I don't have a thinking face. You absolutely have a thinking face. Jason laughed. Fine. Susan pointed at him. What's happening? He considered not answering, then decided honesty was probably the better option. I just realized something. Good or bad? Good. Her shoulders relaxed. Okay. I didn't notice that guy. What guy? Jason motioned vaguely behind him. The guy who spent the last minute trying to get your attention. Susan blinked. What guy? Now it was his turn to stare. You didn't even notice him? No. Jason laughed. A real laugh. The kind that surprised both of them. Because 6 months ago that answer would have been impossible. Susan noticed his expression immediately, and understood. Oh, yeah. A smile spread across her face. Not triumphant, just pleased. The difference mattered. And Jason noticed that too. A year ago she might have viewed this as proving she was right. Today she simply looked happy that he was feeling better, which was healthier. For both of them. Later that week Susan discovered a notebook, Finding it wasn't intentional. She'd been looking for batteries. Instead, she'd opened the wrong drawer in Jason's desk. The notebook was sitting right on top. Open. She hadn't meant to read it. Then she saw her own handwriting, or rather, her own name, repeated several times. Curiosity 1. Jason arrived home an hour later to find her sitting at the kitchen table trying, and failing, to suppress laughter. He immediately became suspicious. What happened? Susan held up the notebook. Jason froze. Oh no. Oh yes. His eyes narrowed. You were snooping. I was looking for batteries. You found emotional damage instead. Susan burst out laughing. The notebook hit the table. Benjamin? Jason immediately covered his face. No. Benjamin? No. That's one of the names? I was making a list. Susan laughed harder. You hate the name Benjamin. I know. Then why is it on the list? Because you were making lists too. She blinked. I was what? Jason immediately regretted speaking. The look on his face confirmed it. Susan sat upright. Oh my God. No. Oh my God. No. You found my notebook. Jason groaned. The truth was he had. Months earlier. Entirely by accident. And inside he'd found something simultaneously adorable and ridiculous. A page titled Future Children Names. Several pages later, Future Cat Names. And somehow the cat section had been significantly longer. Susan stared. You read it. One page. You read all of it. Most of it. Jason. There were personality descriptions. Susan immediately buried her face in her hands. No. There were. No. There was an entire paragraph about a cat named Winston. She made a noise that sounded suspiciously like actual physical pain. Jason couldn't stop laughing. He wears bow ties, Susan. He's fictional. He has hobbies. He doesn't exist. He plays chess. He is a cat. Their eyes met. Then both started laughing. The kind of laughter that made breathing difficult. The kind they'd been missing for months. Eventually Susan wiped tears from her eyes. I cannot believe you found that. I cannot believe you planned imaginary cat personalities. It was private. It was insane. You're insane. Also fair. The laughter settled. Warmth remained. Susan traced a finger along the edge of the notebook. Then quietly asked, Did it scare you? Jason frowned. What? The future stuff. Her voice had softened. The question suddenly felt much more serious. Jason thought about it honestly. For a long moment. Then shook his head. No. Really? Really? She looked surprised. Jason understood why. Because for months she'd probably assumed fear was the reason he'd hesitated about marriage. The truth was more complicated. It wasn't the future that scared me. Susan watched him carefully. It was uncertainty. Something flickered in her expression. Understanding. Jason continued. I always knew what I wanted. You wanted marriage. With the right person. And that was the problem? The problem was wondering if we wanted the same version of marriage. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. Reflective. Susan looked down at the table. I didn't understand that before. I know. I do now. Jason believed her. That realization arrived without hesitation. Without debate. Without qualification. And it surprised him. Not because she'd changed. Because she'd stayed changed. Months of consistent choices. Months of boundaries. Months of behavior matching words. That was what he'd needed. Not perfection. Consistency. The thought lingered long after the conversation ended. That Saturday evening they attended another gathering with friends. Nothing fancy. Just food, drinks, and board games. At one point Jason found himself standing in the kitchen with Emily. She studied him for several seconds. Then smiled. What? Jason immediately became suspicious. People always ask that right before saying something dangerous. What? You look different. I look exactly the same. No. Emily shook her head. Different. Jason frowned. I have no idea what that means. It means you seem relaxed. The observation caught him off guard. Emily continued. A few months ago, every time Susan walked across a room, your eyes followed her. Jason winced. Was it really that obvious? Emily laughed. To literally everyone. That was unfortunate. Now? She glanced toward the living room. Susan was teaching someone a card game. Animated. Happy. Completely herself. Emily smiled. Now you don't seem worried anymore. Jason followed her gaze. For several seconds he didn't answer. Because the truth surprised him. He wasn't worried. Not forcing himself not to worry. Not suppressing concern. Not pretending. He simply wasn't worried. The fear had quietly disappeared somewhere along the way. Replaced by trust. The real kind. Not borrowed trust. Not assumed trust. Earned trust. Emily noticed the realization crossing his face. There was immediate satisfaction in hers. There it is. Jason sighed. What? The future husband face. He rolled his eyes. That's not a thing. It absolutely is. From across the room, Susan glanced toward him. Their eyes met. She smiled. Jason smiled back. then returned to his conversation. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't spend another second wondering what might happen next, because he already knew. Chapter 7. Earning trust. The moment Jason realized he trusted Susan again wasn't dramatic. There was no speech, no revelation, no scene where she proved herself under impossible circumstances. The realization arrived on a Tuesday while he was stuck in traffic, which felt appropriate somehow. Life-changing moments rarely announced themselves beforehand. His phone buzzed through the car speakers. Susan. Jason answered. Hey. Quick question. That's never good. It is when you're right. Jason immediately became suspicious. What happened? I got interrupted halfway through an argument at work. And? Susan sighed dramatically. And I need you to know this because apparently the universe enjoys humiliating me. Jason grinned. I'm listening. There was a salesman. Oh no. There was. What did he do? He spent 5 minutes trying to convince me I needed some ridiculous subscription service. Jason already knew where this was going. And I kept trying to politely end the conversation. His grin widened. Oh, this is going exactly where I think it is. Susan groaned. Then I remembered 6 months ago. Jason laughed. No. Yes. No. Yes. What happened? Susan's voice became flat. Jason. Yes. I established a boundary. He nearly choked laughing. You survived. Barely. The trauma must be immense. It was terrible. Thoughts and prayers. She laughed despite herself. A year ago, the conversation would have irritated him. Today it didn't, because they both understood the joke. Susan had spent so much of her life trying to make everyone comfortable that she'd accidentally made herself uncomfortable instead, and everyone else responsible for her. Now she was learning something she'd never really practiced before. Saying no. Not rudely, not harshly, just clearly. The change had spilled into other areas of her life too. Friends noticed it. Family noticed it. Jason definitely noticed it. How'd the conversation end? He asked. He left. Imagine that. I know. It was shocking. The light ahead finally turned green. Traffic began moving. So what's the quick question? Jason asked. Oh, she laughed. I forgot. Fantastic. Do we have anything planned Saturday? Jason frowned. I don't think so. Good. Why? Because Emily wants everyone over. That's the opposite of having nothing planned. Details. Jason smiled. For a few moments neither spoke. Comfortable silence. The kind that had taken months to recover. Eventually Susan spoke again. Softer this time. I love you. The words still caught him off guard sometimes. Not because they were unusual. Because she said them like she meant them every single time. I love you too. A small pause followed. Then, see you tonight. See you tonight. The call ended. Jason drove the rest of the way home smiling. Saturday evening found their entire friend group gathered at Emily and Mark's house. Food covered every available surface. Music played softly. Board games were scattered across multiple tables. And somehow a debate about whether cereal counted as soup had divided the room. Jason had no idea how that had happened. Nor did he wish to know. This is ridiculous. Mark pointed across the room. No, it isn't soup. It absolutely is. Jason rubbed his eyes. I'm begging both of you to stop. Emily looked offended. We're discussing important issues. You're discussing cereal. Exactly. Susan walked over carrying drinks. What's happening? Nothing good, Jason said. Your boyfriend thinks cereal isn't soup. Susan considered this, then immediately betrayed him. It's not soup. Thank you. Mark looked devastated. I'm surrounded by ignorance. Jason took his drink. How have you survived this long? Strength of character. Delusion. Same thing. Laughter moved through the room. The easy kind. The effortless kind. The kind Jason hadn't realized he'd missed during those difficult months. Eventually, the conversation shifted. People spread out. Games started. Hours passed. At one point, Jason found himself standing near the kitchen while everyone else drifted between rooms. Emily appeared beside him. Can I ask something? That depends. Are you ring shopping? Jason nearly dropped his drink. Emily looked entirely too pleased with herself. Why does everyone ask terrifying questions? Because she was Emily. She ignored him completely. That's a yes. That wasn't a yes. It absolutely was. Jason sighed. Have I mentioned recently that you're annoying? Have I mentioned recently that you're transparent? Unfortunately, she wasn't entirely wrong. Over the last few months, the possibility had returned. Slowly, carefully, like an animal approaching after being frightened away. He'd started looking at rings online. Nothing serious, just browsing, then more browsing, then learning way more about diamonds than any sane person should know. The future no longer felt uncertain. Not because Susan had become perfect, because she'd demonstrated something more important. Consistency. Emily watched his expression, then smiled. That's what I thought. Jason shook his head. You tell anyone and I'll deny everything. I'm telling nobody. You promise. I promise. She paused. Although Susan did once promise she'd never own matching outfits for future cats. Jason winced. Those notebooks should have stayed hidden forever. Agreed. Later that night, everyone gathered around a fire pit in the backyard. Conversations overlapped. Stories got told. People laughed. The temperature had dropped enough that several blankets appeared. Susan eventually sat beside Jason, leaning comfortably against him. Not saying anything, just existing there. The simple familiarity felt nice. For a while they watched the fire, listened to their friends, enjoyed the evening. Then Susan spoke quietly. "Can I ask you something?" Jason glanced down. "Sure." She seemed nervous. That immediately captured his attention. "What?" "I don't want you to tell me what I want to hear." "Okay. I want the truth." Jason waited. Susan stared into the flames. "When did things change?" He knew exactly what she meant. "When did I stop being angry?" She nodded. "When did you start trusting me again?" The answer surprised him, because it wasn't tied to any particular event. No single moment. No specific proof. Just accumulation. "A while ago." Susan looked up. "That's not an answer." "It is." She waited. Jason smiled slightly. "You know what finally convinced me?" "What?" "You stopped trying to convince me." Her eyebrows lifted. "What does that mean?" "It means you weren't performing." Susan frowned. Jason continued. "You weren't changing, so I'd forgive you." "Then why was I changing?" "Because you genuinely understood the problem. The distinction mattered. A lot. When someone changed temporarily, it felt temporary. When someone changed fundamentally, it felt different. Natural. Sustainable. Real." Jason squeezed her hand. "I wasn't watching you anymore." Susan stayed quiet. "So I stopped looking for evidence." The words landed heavily between them, because they both understood what they meant. Trust hadn't returned because she'd passed a test. Trust had returned because eventually there stopped being a test at all. Susan blinked rapidly. The beginnings of tears appeared in her eyes. "Well." Jason immediately became concerned. "Why are you crying?" "I'm not." "You absolutely are. It's emotional." "No kidding." She laughed through it, then wiped at her eyes. "I'm happy, okay?" Jason smiled. "Good." Susan leaned against him again. The fire crackled. Their friends continued talking nearby. And for the first time since the night he'd walked out of that club, neither of them felt like they were rebuilding something damaged. They felt like they were building something new, something stronger, something that actually had a future. Neither said it out loud, but for the first time in a very long time, they were both imagining the same destination.